Hello, happy May 4th, everybody. I'm just recording a quick video to go over your new notes for today. And we're going to just jump right into it. We're going to be talking about the internal structures of the brain. These are notes that you guys have already taken for me in this class, but some of today's homework assignment will refer back to parts of the notes that we have written down here. So I just wanted to remind you that you can refer to some of this to help you with today's work. And then this slide, again, we already took these notes when we talked about the regions of the cerebral cortex. For your assignment today, really these sections here on the brainstem and the cerebellum will show up on your homework assignment, but not very much on the lobes. So don't forget to refer to that. So we're going to be working on this page of your packet, page 4. Again, we already took notes on the major regions of the brain, but as you probably have noticed that there are some little sections we still haven't filled out yet. So we're going to do those right now. So again, we took these notes before, okay? Nothing too terribly new. So I took the same picture I drew on before, but you can notice here I've added some color and added some other labels. I'm going to go through them one at a time though on this screen. If you want to go back and view the full picture, please open up my slideshow to do that and be successful on your homework. All right, so jumping right in here, we're going to be labeling some things that we haven't labeled yet. Okay, I do have X's on like the G and the D because you don't need to know those guys, but most of the rest of these will get filled out. So the first one, it's a little covered up. You'll see it here in a second. But A is pointing to the corpus callosum. That's this section right here. We mentioned it last week when we were talking about the thing that connects the two cerebral hemispheres. So it's this little section right here. It's kind of flat. If you were to cut into a brain, you'd have to cut through that corpus callosum to separate the two halves. B is the choroid plexus. It's kind of this like black little squiggly line right here that surrounds kind of this little tongue-like shape in the middle of the brain, part of the diencephalon. That is what makes cerebral spinal fluid for our body. All right, moving down. Again, you don't need to know D, so you can cross that out. E is the optic chiasma. This little section here would be kind of cut in this brain. And what it does is it ends up connecting to one of the cranial nerves that connects to the eyes. So you can think E for eyes, it's the optic chiasma. It's basically a connector to the nerve that goes to your eyes. All right, moving down and around here, we've got F. Okay, this is pointing to the pituitary gland, and it kind of has these two little lobes to it. We will talk about the pituitary gland in great detail in the next unit for endocrine system. It's considered our master gland. You don't need to know G, right? And we've already talked about our parts of our brainstem, our pons medulla, and then the midbrain we already have labeled. But moving on over here, I'm going to get into more detail in just a second, but the penal gland, or sometimes called the penal body, if you can read that, is here on the back. So we have two different glands inside of our brain, the pituitary and the penal. The penal gland is the one that's responsible for melatonin, which is your sleepfulness and wakefulness cycles of your body. All right. These guys, L and K, I'll get into more details here in a minute on them, but we find cerebral spinal fluid in these little spaces. So L is the cerebral aqueduct. That's AQUEDUCT, cerebral aqueduct. I'm going to type these out on the side here in a second if it's hard for you to read my handwriting. And K right here, it's basically in this little space between the cerebellum and the brainstem. It's called the fourth ventricle. And in both of these, the cerebral aqueduct and the fourth ventricle, we find cerebral spinal fluid. All right. Now, this is where you might want 3 different colors of coloring utensils. The color does not matter. I used red, blue, and orange because they were different from the other colors I'd used on this page already, but it does not matter at all what color you pick. But just like the spinal cord has meninges, the brain has meninges as well, which we've labeled a close-up version of this. So I want to show you these meninges on the brain. So the dura mater or dura mater, I've colored in red, and you can see that it goes all the way around the entire brain, the brainstem, and extends down past into the spinal cord. And so it's making up the layers there. Then the next layer of the meninges is the arachnoid mater. And the arachnoid mater I colored in blue. So you can see this light blue color. That's the arachnoid mater that covers and protects our brain. It also would be found in our spinal cord. And then the third layer that's touching the brain itself, so I colored that in orange, and you can see that the cerebrum has this layer of orange surrounding it, is the pia mater. Now, I drew little lines too to point to each of these, so you can see my three meninges, outermost to innermost. Think DAP, dura, arachnoid, pia, DAP. And then we have the space underneath the arachnoid mater right here, kind of looks spider webby, and that's where arachnoid gets its name for spiders, spider webs. This is the subarachnoid space. So I mentioned before the importance of cerebral spinal fluid. It basically creates this water airbag surrounding your brain. You can see that space right here. So there's cerebral spinal fluid all in this area of the subarachnoid space. It basically protects your brain. It gives it a little bit of cushioning. Now we also have, as I just mentioned, cerebral spinal fluid inside some of these, what we call the ventricles, or the spaces inside the brain. I'll get into that more later. So I didn't have much room here to write the functions of these guys. So I've created a little list that we're going to go over here in just a second. So you can write it out on the side, or if you can write small, just kind of, they're short and sweet. You could write them right next to each little structure that we have here if you've got the room. So I wanted to throw this joke back up here, the corpus callosum, the great mediator. So that was one of the first ones we labeled. This guy right here, I'm showing you kind of a cross section of it, but it has sort of this diagonal crisscross where it connects my two cerebral hemispheres. So we'll start off with its definition. It's the fiber tracts that connect my two cerebral hemispheres. I just said that. The next one we went over was the choroid plexus, and as I mentioned, it produces CSF. You can write CSF if you remember what it stands for. If you won't, then write it out, cerebral spinal fluid. Then we talked about the optic chiasma, and it connects to the optic nerve. The pituitary gland, it's considered the master gland of the body, and it controls all of your hormones. The penal gland, or the penal body, it's sometimes called, is the gland that produces melatonin. And melatonin is that hormone that controls your wakefulness and sleepfulness of your body. And then the ventricles. I only have two of them pictured on here because they're kind of difficult to view in this kind of a cross section, but there's really four ventricles. Going in order from kind of the top to the bottom, we have what are called the lateral ventricles. They're not pictured. The third ventricle, not pictured. The cerebral aqueduct, which is right here, this teeny tiny tube right there. And then lastly, the fourth ventricle, which is also pretty small, right here in between my brainstem and cerebellum. And then if you followed this down right here, this little track would eventually turn into my central canal. It's that little tiny hole that runs through the length of my spinal cord. So these four ventricles store cerebral spinal fluid. It's produced right here by the choroid plexus, and it circulates on the inside of the brain, but also then we have cerebral spinal fluid circulating on the outside of the brain along that arachnoid mater. And that's really important to protect your body structures. I don't have the definitions here of the meninges because we've been over those, and they're just protective structures. All right. So moving on here, let's see. This picture is a much better view of those ventricles. So if we were going from top to bottom, as you can kind of see, this is the side lateral view, and this is from the front. These ventricles are literally just like spaces, holes, a big chamber inside of your brain that allows for fluid to be on the inside as well as fluid on the outside. So the lateral ventricles, there's 2 of them, and they spread out to the sides laterally. That's where they get their name. The third ventricle is attached, which then connects to the cerebral aqueduct, which then goes down to the fourth ventricle, and then eventually down into the spinal cord and central canal. And there's fluid all in these spaces. Why they don't call them the first, second, third, and fourth, I have no idea. They didn't ask me when they named these things, but there are 4, and then it connects to the central canal. But we have the lateral ventricles, the third ventricle, the cerebral aqueduct, and the fourth ventricle. The cerebral aqueduct is pretty tiny, and its main job is to connect the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. Okay, now we've already labeled this structure in your notes, but since we just color coordinated the outside of our brain, I thought this would be a good place for you to use whatever color utensils you used and color on your packet. So this picture is, just flip the page on page 5. And you could sort of color in our different layers. So just like on the other picture, orange here is representing my pia mater touching the brain exactly. The blue layer here is my arachnoid mater. You can kind of see the spider webs in my subarachnoid space. And then the dura mater is kind of this 2 double layer here. It kind of extends over the top, but also dips down in between the 2 cerebral hemispheres. So I would encourage you to take a moment to color this guy. And while we're at it, coloring other structures, we've got our 3 layers as well on the spinal cord here. By the way, here's that central canal. You would find cerebral spinal fluid inside that little hole running through your spinal cord. So on the very next page, page 6, we have this picture. I would also encourage you to color code your 3 meninges as well while we're at it. So again, this outer layer, the red layer, is the dura mater, the middle layer, the arachnoid mater, and then that inner layer is my pia mater, DAP, from outermost to innermost, DAP. All right, that is it for today. And I would be amiss if I did not tell you, may the 4th be with you. I hope you guys have an awesome day. Bye-bye.